We released it this year though.
No, 2 weeks ago. Really.
2 weeks ago. A friend of mine, he smashed it. Welcome to Thin Ice. This week we will be picking the brains of two esteemed experts in their field. On my left, I have the Solicitor General for New South Wales, Michael Sexton, who has honoured the position since 1998. That's right, it's as long as I've been alive. Michael has written a number of articles for The Spectator, The Courier Mail and The Australian, some of which are printed in his book, here today, called Dissenting Opinions. On my right, I've got Dr. Tanveer Ahmed, who is a psychiatrist and author practicing in Inner West Sydney. Tanveer is a regular contributor to Sky News, The Australian, The Financial Review and The Australian newspaper. This year, he released his new book, In Defence of Shame, an excellent read, which looks at the history and contemporary rise of shame and its overlap with group identity and mental health. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be with you, Joel.
Thank you indeed.
So, the biggest reason why I really wanted to get both of you into the show today was I've got a psychiatrist on my right and a legal expert, a giant, I would say, on my left. Now, we've seen this massive pandemic sort of take over the world and completely uproot everything that we're doing. Tanveer, I've heard you talk on the pandemic, especially early on, around about April. You did a speech at the Sydney Institute where you warned about the dangers of going down a route where the lockdown, perhaps being a response, is a very dangerous path to go down. In fact, I would also say that you're probably in the minority of opinions on that being expressed on the mainstream media about an alternative response to this. Can you please speak to perhaps some of the psychological impacts of a lockdown on those losing their jobs, those being cooped up at home and stuff like that?
No, thanks, Joel. Yeah, look, the mental health is in the background of both the crisis we face now, both health and economic. Look, I think in April, there was a lot of uncertainty. So I think right across the world, there was a degree of overreach. I think we can see that scientific models, we often hear this term, look at the science. Well, we can see that every model, economic or medical, has a set of values and opinions and assumptions built into them. So, it's really an opinion with a bit of maths, and graphs in it. So we have to be careful about how much we embrace models without question. And I think that came across early on, where some of the reactions, particularly in the United Kingdom, were very much overreach, and they relied heavily on specific models such as the Imperial College model. Now we're seeing from there a variety of different tacks, don't we? We're seeing Sweden, we're seeing Victoria now, and I'm seeing it in my patients, the potential effect of lockdown. Look, I think overall it's very hard to be too harsh because this will play out over a long period of time. There's no question lockdown, we're social beings, being stuck at home without routines, without that regular contact. I'm seeing it especially amongst young people. So because the sectors hit the most, tourism, hospitality, the arts, and there's a lot of young people really losing their rituals, their structure, and they're often falling into new structures such as substance abuse. Thankfully, we haven't seen an uptick in suicide rates as yet, even though that has been predicted. We'll wait and see. Yeah. On another realm, there's another group that to some extent have arguably, if not improved, but that certainly haven't worsened. And many of those are the introverts, some of the people who actually quite like the fact that they're not continue being pushed to perform or socialise. And because we do live in that sort of society where a service economy demands almost constant performance. So there's a set of people that actually quite like being able to hide out and not having to constantly play those sort of interactions. So it's not entirely negative for lots of people there. Look, I think Victoria obviously made some really big mistakes. In relation to my book, one of the things I argue, we're in an unusual time. We've arguably gone through a half century of what might be called expressive individualism. So both social and economic. It's more about sort of individual expression, individual desire. And in some ways we're seeing kind of a bit of an exclamation mark. The pandemic is also working on that, which we're seeing a much bigger focus on, say, mutual obligation. And we almost have this version of public health morality at the moment, where we almost have a shared set of values, which to some extent is unusual because we live in such a diverse societies. We live in sort of privatised, kind of urban suburbia, most of us. So we're actually in unusual periods where rare time we actually have a shared set of values now around a public health version of morality. Now there's still variations there, but that raises some interesting issues.
That's a very interesting topic, and it's sort of a running joke, isn't it, that all the introverts have come out and they're sort of like, we've got to go into lockdown for 5-6 months. I've been doing this for my whole life. I'm so ready for this. I've been going to the gym for this forever.
Many of my patients are well ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Michael, firstly, welcome to the show. I did want to start off by just touching on that point that we got from Tanveer. We are seeing certainly a more cohesive response to what's been going on in terms of the government. There have been a lot of different government officials where the old lines have sort of been blurred, and they've sort of been working a little bit more cohesively to overcome the virus, whether it be through, sponsoring things like JobKeeper. It's about who's going to be betting more. It's going to be about who can do the most for the people. Are you sort of seeing that on the legal side of this?
I just should say at the outset that in speaking today, for anything that's in the book, I'm not speaking, of course, for the New South Wales government, but it is interesting that one of the results of all of this has been, for example, this National Cabinet, for example, which up until now has been seemingly working fairly cooperatively. There's something of a breakdown about the border situation, I think, at the moment. But it is true, I think, that given that normally there's a lot of political frictions between different governments in Australia and between the state and federal levels, that on this occasion, I think the gravity of the situation has in fact forced a degree of cooperation. I'd like to think that this might continue when hopefully we return to a different kind of climate, but I suspect that the old verities will reassert themselves when that happens.
In a post-COVID world, sort of thing. Yeah, it is kind of... I was watching in America their sort of politics. I was curious, because America's sort of the epitome of gung-ho, flag-waving patriots, It's a new religion. It's a second religion over there, their politics. And I was curious to see if for a brief moment that would sort of pass and they'd sort of work together. And there was a few days where I even saw on CNN, of all places, they were actually commending, you're not going to believe this, I had to see it to believe it, they were actually commending Donald Trump of being strong and shutting the borders and being, people need this for now, and then it was very quickly that switched. I'm hoping that really doesn't happen in Australia, but I'm not that old, but I'm a skeptic on this particular topic. I really hope that the government works together on this, and we hope to foster in a new world of sort of a cohesion in Australia rather than division, which hasn't gotten us very far.
It's important to note, I think, that the US is a very different sort of society from Australia and even from countries in Europe, and it has proved impossible, as it turns out, in the US to have the kind of health measures that you've had in Australia and in most European countries. Now that whether or not that's a criticism of US society is a matter for judgment, but it is a very different kind of society, and as I say, it just simply proved impossible really to implement the same kind of measures.
Joel, one thing I would say, and I'd be interested in what Michael thinks, is just how compliant Australians have been. You're referring to, say, the libertarian ethos that you see in the United States, particularly in the South. It's amazing. We sort of see ourselves as larrikins, but arguably we're incredibly compliant. You look at how much popular support there is for essentially blocking the states and kind of upending the federation, so to speak. I do think we have a real culture. We seem to very much embrace what might be called safetyism, kind of ever-increasing safetyism, ever-increasing, what's sometimes called the nanny state. And I think, and I've written about this, where I argue partly Partly it's because we're one of the most prosperous, most peaceful societies in the world, and arguably we haven't had to contend with, real threats, at least relative to most other nations. So I think we overreach. So there's less we can tolerate. And I'd also argue there's a significant death taboo. I don't think we can tolerate just the sight of... Because we have so little contact with it.
We do.
I think, I'm not... You probably grew up all in Australia, but my early, my first 5-6 years was in Bangladesh. And while I barely remember it, but even when we visit, death is right in front of you. You'll walk the streets and there'll be a dead body being cremated. And we have very little contact with that. And I do think that colours some of our overreach. We just won't tolerate even discussions where we're trying to measure the cost of death versus the economics of it. You get a sense people just won't even tolerate these sort of discussions.
I'm very concerned about the metrics that are being used. I forgot the young lady that lectures.
Jean. I've forgotten it too. I know exactly who you're talking about.
She also spoke with you. I'm going to take this interview, guys, because it was really excellent. It was with you and it was with another expert who also appeared on a Q&A panel and talked on these issues. I think she was also on 60 Minutes.
Well, she's been very strident about saying, look, each life is effectively worth this much. The measure she uses, which public health experts too use, quality of life, years. So you're measuring life in terms of years lived, not just a life. So realistically, even though we don't like to argue that, and the life of an 85-year-old is not equal to the life of a 25-year-old. I think everyone would implicitly recognise that, but arguing that in public is a very at a sacred level. Yes, it is. I can understand at a religion, at a pure sort of economic level and trying to make policy. I don't think it is.
Yes, and I think I've heard Tanveer talk on this in terms of the political. Sort of stomach for it. I can't see any party that's willing to say that you should let grandma die, or the usual insults that are traded. But no, the point must be made. A 25-year-old person that's looking for a job and they can't, and I think you've said they're more represented on casual sort of work. If they can't get out and get a job, what are the after effects of that? You can't measure one pandemic on a weekly basis on the effects. You've got to look at it on the span of the pandemic and the span of that life and the impact on that life. I found that very fascinating and certainly a nuanced way of looking at this. And I'm perplexed as to why our government officials aren't actually treating this pandemic with a bit more nuance. Rather, it's a daily case number. It's so bland and linear. And I'm a very humble guy. I'm a very young guy. But I recognize that there are more sophisticated ways to think about certain things, this being one of them. So I get very, perhaps, disillusioned when I see the best of us, the people that we've risen up to lead our country and represent us on the world stage, and to bat for us, to be talking about these matters in such a deluded and I would go as far as saying it's non-scientific. This week we saw a letter come out in Victoria, didn't we, which was from, I think, 12 different experts in their field, doctors, all saying that we urge you to look into this matter and to study this in different ways. One of the points they brought up was there was this study done in the UK where 4,000 people were found to have not screened for cancer, or which could actually go up to 35,000 people that might not be screened for cancer and therefore will die from cancer just from this year because of lockdown. So I'm really concerned about that. But can you give me a glimmer of hope, Michael? I've seen you talk about a number of different global phenomenon. All of you should buy this book. Some of your articles on Brexit were I really enjoyed them. I followed Brexit for a little while now, since 2016, and I found it absolutely entertaining seeing how you sort of weaved the different moving factors together. Is there something of a global phenomenon here where we're sort of returning back to a sense of the nation state and normalcy?
Well, certainly one aspect of it has been, I think, simply because of the closure of borders, at least on a temporary and in Australia's case still on a semi-permanent basis. I think there has been a more focus on the on the nation state than on on concepts of globalism. And I've sometimes, just most recently, writing about problems of immigration and refugees, which is really a problem of what kind of borders you can have with a nation state. And we're seeing in Europe that it's been very difficult to maintain those borders, or to confine entry to people who are part of an authorised immigration program, or in some cases an authorised recognised refugee program. So I think to some extent, and just the sheer volume of people in terms of population movements away from the Middle East and Africa towards Europe, I think that has to some extent focused people's minds on the notion of the nation state, and perhaps giving it more importance than has been done perhaps over recent decades. There are still people, of course, who, one of the points of the Brexit debate was that there were people in Europe, in the European Union, who simply say that there should be no national borders at all. So that there is a real debate here, but I think certainly the pandemic has, as I say, together with the immigration question, has perhaps given some credence to the idea of the nation state that had been falling into some kind of disrepair over recent decades.
Couldn't you got anything to add on that, Tanveer?
Yeah, look, I'm very interested in Mike, because I have seen how he's written about Brexit and these things. And I'd argue, the pandemic in some ways is an extension of some of those trends, and you allude to that, whether, people are in some ways, if not retreating, it's arguably a full stop on half a century of a certain type of political trends, and we're seeing a bit of a shift into, in some ways, a certain view of man, right? A certain view of man, and some have called it a more religious view of man, not religious in the sense that I believe in God or I pray to church, this sort of stuff. More like a certain view of how we live, kind of the nuclear family, or kind of man and woman in marriage, kind of backyard, or that sort of nuclear family, this sort of stuff. A certain way of life. There's an element of retreat into that. So arguably this little period, whether it's prolonged, we can wait and see. So I think that's a very powerful historical trend that Trump and Brexit was already alluding to. And they certainly view things like pandemics speed up elements of history. And I think there is some truth to that. We see that, say, the rush to digital for one example. So whether it's speeding up some political trends or not, I think there's a grain of truth to that.
I find that in itself fascinating. I mean, the COVID-19 has definitely sort of brought to the surface a lot of the surface issues that we perhaps didn't see that are underlying the surface. I mean, the faults in our trade, our manufacturing, were all coming out. I mean, I think in the US they had something like 80 to 90% of their medication was made in China. And they quickly realized, hang on a sec, we can't do this, especially with what some would consider a very strategic and perhaps military rival to the US and a rising superpower. So, I mean, I find it very fascinating, because we watch this like it's a sport, politics, geopolitics, and to see things speed up so rapidly is there's an entertaining aspect to it, because it's like, I was right about this. You mentioned something in your opening, which was that people have a shared sense of purpose because of this. And I've heard a lot of so please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I've heard a lot of your commentary on this where you've said, suicides aren't necessarily going up. However, people are finding a shared sense of struggle in this, which has been lacking, especially in perhaps the Anglosphere. What is that? No,
I think that's true. So we forget that. So for example, many people, my patients with anxiety disorders, some of them have actually improved because their sense of threat is more. It feels more shared now. Normally, it felt very individualised, and a lot of mental health is, certainly on certain measures, Western societies, particularly the most prosperous Western societies, often have higher rates of sort of anxiety, depression, and part of that's measurement. Part of it's how we view the experience. So we talk more in the language of psychology in Western lives. But a lot of it is that people just lead more kind of lonely, individualised lives. So, and even though the pandemic hasn't necessarily improved loneliness, and for many people it's worsened it, at a kind of broad level, people do feel a stronger sense of shared purpose, be it with their neighbours. And it's also linked people to the local more. Yeah. So, we see the CBD dead, but local coffee shops are busier than ever, many of them, because all these people are working from home. Even before this show, Joel, I just went to grab a coffee, and the owner just around the corner came up to me and goes, "Oh, you must be working from home." I go, no, I'm not actually. I'm just going to go to show up the road. But so it's just changed some trends, and even amongst families. I mean, a lot of kids, as challenging as it was for, say, do online teaching, I mean, many of them are seeing their parents a lot more than they have for a long time, rather than people rushing around, two-parent families working. So the whole sets of people, I think, will reappraise and how they prioritise a whole range of things. So there will be lots of positives that come out of this.
You also mentioned earlier that suicides are down. Not down, but then there's no significant uptick that we're seeing. For example, in the US, I think their suicide call center was up like 500.
Well, calls have definitely gone up, so we should certainly qualify that. So lifeline calls have certainly gone up. And look, these things, unfortunately, these things can take time, and there's so many different factors that might lead to suicide. But I do think we underestimate sometimes just human resilience. I think we do live. My last book, Joel, was called Fragile Nation. And my argument there was that the modern society, again, particularly in the Western world, we almost construct the human being as innately fragile. Yeah. Right? Whereas most of human history, we wouldn't have seen people like that. Yeah. So we almost expect people to kind of fall apart when, people get through world wars and all manner of things, Yeah. So given the welfare state and support we have in our society, it's an extraordinary. We probably never had a bigger, thrust of government benefits than in human history that we have around the world in the last sort of 6 months. So those sort of capacities just weren't around in the past.
Yeah, I have to admit it's a little bit worrying when I see the national debt graphs and just see it crash, just absolutely plain crash. I'm too young to be thinking about the debt, but I'll have to think about it more than anyone else because I think I'll be paying it off for the rest of my life, unless a new monetary system gets pulled out somewhere. But I wanted to talk about the border closures, Michael. What is the constitutionality of that? Because Tanveer mentioned that Australia is a very they'll go with the politicians they trust when things go terribly. And we've just seen the union of, basically the Australian states basically fall apart in terms of, premiers stepping on each other's toes, the federal government struggling to keep it together. And I think right as we speak, as we're filming this, we are seeing this transpire, this sort of that friction between Scott Morrison and Victoria and Queensland with their premiers.
Well, there is a case in the High Court, although New South Wales is not involved, but this is the case that Clive Palmer has brought against the Western Australian government. There was a Queensland case as well, but it's not still on foot. So the legal question is whether Section 92 of the Constitution, which talks about freedom of trade and intercourse between the states, allows the closure of the borders, or some of the borders, in these circumstances, most particularly given that it's the case before the court, the Western Australian border. Now, there's no precedence for any of this, no precedence for what's happened and no precedence in the court. But, so, under Section 92, there can be regulation of trade and intercourse, but there's a notion of, I suppose, this is not particularly precise, but a notion of reasonability in the circumstances. So that's the kind of inquiry that the High Court will be making. It's to some extent, of course, a value judgment. As I say, there's no great precision here. I would have thought myself, just as a matter of personal opinion, that the High Court would be very wary in this kind of pandemic situation to find that a state government was not entitled to have some sorts of border restrictions. But the contrary argument is that, say, in Western Australia, there are no cases, I don't think, at the moment. The border's still closed. There's no prospect, seemingly, of it opening in the immediate future. So this will be a matter of argument before the court, and we don't have any previous cases to look at in this area. There are cases about freedom of trade and restrictions on that as between the states, but we don't have anything like this where borders have been closed. So, as I say, I think you'd have to, in the current climate, make out a very strong argument against the closure of borders, because obviously Western Australia can point to Victoria and New South Wales as areas where there are still outbreaks of the virus. But anyway, that's the argument before the court.
Well, state leaders have never enjoyed such authority, haven't they? There's almost this presidential quality about, Dan Andrews' addresses, or Gladys to some extent, and you have Anastasia, the Premier of Queensland, kind of just coming out with these orders with very little consultation outside the state. I'm not sure that's entirely a good thing. I mean, I'm sure they're lapping it up, but I'm not sure it's entirely a great thing for the Federation. Don't you think, Michael?
Well, the Prime Minister obviously wants to see the borders reopened as soon as possible, and probably some of them. I mean, I imagine he would say now, in some cases. We talked before about the compliance factor in Australia, certainly in comparison with the United States. And I think it has been interesting over the last 6 months that it's been possible to have these very severe restrictions for a time in all the states, and still, of course, in Victoria, without seemingly any real complaint from the general population. And in terms of the restrictions on borders, much the same could be said. I think there's obviously some unhappiness, I think, in relation to the closure of the borders, the Australian borders, internationally, in the sense that there are people who are overseas, holders of Australian passports, who want to return and are having difficulties in doing that. And there are some people, I think, in Australia who want to travel overseas and are not concerned about the risks. They're prepared to do it, but at the moment they're not able to do so.
It's very concerning from a leadership perspective. I mean, as a Prime Minister, holding the union together, the Commonwealth, is a challenging job from a leadership perspective when you've got such a hyper-partisan sort of political atmosphere right now. I don't think premiers have ever had this kind of power, even at the start of the Commonwealth, when they were sort of unifying. I mean, the level of technology and what that allows premiers to do, if they really wanted, they could go the direction of China, which is very, very concerning with their social credit system and how they watch. I think they've got a camera for every 5 people or something like that to watch everyone and track them. Do you think, Michael, that these border closures are going to... I mean, is this something that the Prime Minister could even override? Because I don't think he could. And look, to an extent, because we can't keep having these border closures forever. At what point? It's not a science, but at what point does the Prime Minister step in and say, look, we can't keep doing this anymore?
I'll answer the question, but I was just going to say it's interesting that, of course, the history of since Federation in Australia has really been one of the gradual dominance of the Commonwealth at the expense of the states, particularly financially. But as you point out, just in the last 6 months, there's been some sort of extraordinary prominence given to state premiers and to the role of the states. On the question of powers, arguably the Commonwealth could override the closure of the state borders. There'd be a lot of arguments about that, but there's federal legislation in the health and biodiversity area which would certainly allow an argument to be made. But I think the Prime Minister takes the view that he doesn't want to take that course, and that he feels that he has to leave this up to the states, at least for the moment, even though I think it's pretty clear that in some instances he thinks that some of those borders should be opened.
I certainly, look, where I fall on the border closure situation is I think that the borders could be closed for, if we're talking economically and the impacts of that, they could be closed for a relatively long time and us be fine. But what can't happen is the amount of life years lost, as you've put forward as a new metric. I don't think we can sustain that with like stage 4 lockdowns like what we're seeing in Victoria. And I think there's a lot of unrest really building. I mean, I've got my finger on the pulse on the online. I honestly think there are over 100,000 people across the state of Victoria that are ready to basically protest and riot right now. They're very angry.
Well, this entire industry is just shut down, and all very well to have strong support for your Premier if you're not affected directly, at least not immediately. I mean, down the track you may well be if your economy becomes a basket case. So I agree with you. In places like Queensland, you've got these extraordinary, tourism resorts. They've virtually got no cases. Some of it is ridiculous, and it's it's posturing to some extent. And I don't think it can, continue forever. I mean, one point I'd like to touch on with Michael, like I used to serve on local government in West Sydney, the city of Canada Bay, and I did find I was very interested in what Michael was saying, where I think there has been a steady centralisation of power, and on that respect, I would like more decentralisation. Like, I think it is important that you have, relatively strong local governments in certain areas, and you get local decision making. I think that's an important part of just the information. It's far better that information seeps down. Yeah. It's a bit like, say, those on the front line of a business, having access to information which then filters up to the CEO. So arguably that is a trend that is positive. I think we've had too much centralisation of power. And I think if you're, someone who, I'm not saying I'm a big conservative, but if you're vaguely sort of, right-leaning or liberal-leaning, you should you want transparency, you want spread of power. So perhaps a bit of decentralisation is a good thing. Yeah. But, if it turns into these authoritarian states with presidential premiers, I don't think that's what we want.
Yeah. I should have added the one thing that's interesting, or I find interesting in Australia, is that despite the last 6 months and all of the dramas of that and the role of the Prime Minister and the various premiers, that this doesn't seem to have affected the political situation in Australia, that the polls indicate that the still an even division in the two-party preferred vote between the government and the opposition at the federal level, and the Tory government still appears, having won a rather large victory at the last election, appears to be still maintaining that kind of popularity. So it's I just find it interesting that all of this doesn't seem to have really affected the underlying political realities in Australia, which are that at the federal level the numbers are always very relatively close. There aren't many landslide elections at the federal level in Australia. There's often a bigger gap at the state level, but as I say, it doesn't appear to have affected that in recent times. There's an election, of course, next month, I think, in Queensland, which may provide some guidance on all of that. But as I say, just it's just one aspect of this that strikes me, that despite all of the impact, that's one thing that it doesn't seem to have affected.
Yeah. In my first episode of this podcast, which has reached over 140,000 people, which I'm very proud of, thank you everyone for sharing it. That's how it gets so big so quickly. I had a very fascinating conversation with a guy named Romeo Georges, who was sitting there, and Ricardo Bossi, and I couldn't help but feel that I've got to ask you this, Michael. Tanveer. I really have to ask you this as a psychiatrist. People that are drawn to politics, is there underlying problems there psychologically? I have to ask this question because I've only been interacting in politics for about 5 years now, since I left school, and I can't help but feel that often people if they've got problems, if they've got underlying problems, rather than deal with them, they will then reflect that onto their politics. And I found that that's the worst sort of thing they could do. Am I wrong? Am I completely off on this?
No, not at all. I mean, look, ultimately, say we have individual grievances or individual resentments. It's always, and it's fundamentally political to argue to what extent is that related to your internal state or your internal makeup, or versus to what extent is that partly a function of the social makeup or the external makeup. And to a big degree that describes the fulcrum of politics, and a lot of it's my job too, where I'm seeing people who with their own problems, but that what you're referring to is projection.
Yes.
But sometimes that's appropriate.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're distressed and there's things in the environment that are contributing to that.
Yeah.
But I think activists often have a bit of an edge, and we need those people. If we're all very well adjusted and not terribly driven,
Sometimes
not much would happen. So certainly the activist, I think what you're referring to, will often, to some people, will feel like they have a screw loose, right? But we need those people. Yeah. We need those people, and some of them will be outright mad. Yeah. And you are, I think, on both edges of politics, so the extremes of politics. Yeah. When you meet some of them, many of them are a quid shorts to some extent. But in some ways they're actually channeling it healthily sometimes, because if you find a movement where you feel like you belong, that can do a lot of damage too, I guess, but in some ways they're actually channeling it healthily, where they've found a group with possibly similar beliefs, and they're organising, and they're feeling a sense of purpose and direction. So that's a much healthier transmission of resentment or distress than say using drugs or self-harming or something like that. So you are right that activists will certainly sometimes be a little bit shaky, but we need those people.
No, absolutely. And I think the Me Too movement's a perfect example of that, because it started off as a very good sort of movement to sort of expose some of the ugly actions of sexual in nature of those in Hollywood, and it exposed a lot of people like Weinstein, and that ended up basically starting a big movement where women felt comfortable speaking out. But then again, it goes long enough, and it turns out that people start avoiding the legal system, and it's more a public mobbing, and it sort of goes too far. So look from hearing that, I've got no doubt there are a lot of people that do sort of pour perhaps their own experiences into that. But a lot of it is legitimate, and a lot of them they're sort of reflecting what they've experienced in their own lives. But look, I do you think that they're sort of drawn to power as a way of sort of creating a change, or it's like a out of care or a protective thing? Or
look, it'll be variable. I mean, when you look at people who've entered politics, they certainly have a higher rate of they've often had deaths in the family. So it's interesting when they've been studied, you look at Bill Clinton or you name it, there's a host of figures, and you look at their lives, they've often had an early death in the family.
You're not talking about the Clinton body count, are you? Or?
His father died early, but look, Barack Obama, abandoned sort of father, but that's very common. So in terms of why people are drawn to politics, often they are people who, I guess, maybe have an especially strong urge to feel like they've left some kind of mark. The world's just that slightly bit better. I mean, obviously you can do that a whole range of ways, but arguably modern politics is a different breed. And I've found, I guess I've dabbled a little bit in the political sphere. So I do wonder, because now the modern community groups are so so different. But so few people say sign up for the Liberal or Labor Party, whereas previously it might have been a better representation of a mass movement or the broader community. And I know John Howard's spoken about this a lot. So arguably modern politics attracts more eccentrics than it may have previously. So maybe in the past, if you went to a Liberal Party or Labor Party meeting, it would have been a much stronger cross-section. And I often measure it, say I go to my kids' sport on the weekend, I'd often I look at that and I think, okay, what portion of these people have even the remotest ties with a political party or political, and the fact is almost no one.
Yes.
Which is a real indictment. And then you might go to a political meeting, and often it will be eccentrics.
Yes.
So there's a lot of eccentrics. So I think modern politics seems to attract a different breed, which is why you get these sort of professional politicians. And in some ways it's almost a group where it's an eccentric group where this is where they belong. And it's almost, I mean, you know, you could almost jokingly call it kind of a Revenge of the Nerds type sort of thing. It's like, we're going to show them, and we're going to rise to power, and we're going to stick it to all the people who slagged us off at uni or something like this. You know, there's a component of that in modern politics, which I don't think was as was pronounced, say, decades ago.
It's sort of a school monitor sort of thing.
But I think also the average person who achieves, you know, the most highest achieving, the best and brightest, I just think politics isn't as attractive as it was once. I mean,
that's sad. I mean, some of the best legal minds, Michael, have gone in. Are some really intelligent people, whereas I think that a lot of them should be going into politics to sort of lead the nation out. I mean, how do you feel about that? Because a lot of, my brother's a very intelligent young man. He's studying actuarial studies. It's at the top of his class. All the scholar students come to him for tutoring, but he wouldn't consider politics for 2 seconds. Not at all. No one wants to get their hands dirty. Do you sort of see this sort of phenomena in the legal profession?
Well, there's been a lot of changes, and 40 and 50 years ago, you had lawyers, go into politics. I mean, you had people like Sir Garfield Barwick, for example, as a classic sort of a case, who was at the top of the bar and went into politics and became the federal Attorney General. But what's happened now, I think, over the last 30 perhaps years, is that that political parties are they've never been large entities in Australia, but less representative now, I think, than they were 30 and 40 years ago of the general population. And one thing that's happened is that that people have started to go into politics very young, mostly working for ministers at a relatively early age, or in the Labor Party, working in the union movement, so that these people don't have any real work experience apart from politics. They're very often trying to organise a seat in the Parliament while they're doing these things. Then, if that happens, they're still relatively young when they go into the Parliament. One of the consequences of all this, that, I mean, a lot of these careers are then finished when people are in their late 40s or their early 50s. But all of this means, I think, that you've got a rather unrepresentative group who are on both sides of politics now, largely, and they've been full-time activists in a sense since quite a young age. I don't think overall this can be a good thing, but it's what the situation that we've got to in Australia, and I don't think that it's likely to change in the immediate future. But of course, your brother's an interesting example, because in many ways it excludes almost the entire population from this political world, because unless they start almost at school age being an activist and securing a post with a politician or with a union, then there's no possibility of later entry.
Yes.
It's very hard to enter mid-career. Yeah. I mean, one thing I see in the job, I do think most people most people these days do not necessarily see politics as a path to kind of self-improvement, if you like. It's not necessarily how their life's going to improve. So they're far more likely to come to me thinking, okay, I'll improve my mental state or my physique. That people seek salvation in different ways, through sort of psychic security and health and well-being, this sort of thing. So increasingly, just people just don't see the path that if I do politics and so what, it's not necessarily going to. They don't necessarily see as that causing any particular change in their lives, which is problematic. I think it's a problem. It may be that the minutiae of politics, they can't see that intangible differences when it's having little impacts all the time. But I think that's a big reason why people stay away. On top of the various scandals and what have you, and there is that sort of loss of trust in traditional authority in many respects. We see the pandemic. The one key authority people do still trust is science, and to some extent my profession. Doctors are probably at the top of the tree in terms of people still can trust. The military, there's certain institutions people still have a strong trust in, but I'm not sure politics is one of them, unfortunately.
I'd be curious to hear both of your thoughts on the voting age, because I've got a very I bet you couldn't pick my view on the voting age. I don't think we should be able to vote until possibly 30, 35. I'll be completely honest with you. Now, obviously, there's the arguments that come up where it's if you're not old enough to vote, if you're old enough to go to war, you're old enough to vote. Basically, those arguments come up. But I actually somewhat disagree with them. I think we should have a different way of perhaps voting. Maybe it should be a voting age, but we run into issues like that. But what I've proposed is I think that if you paid tax for the last few years since the last election, you should be able to vote. I don't like people who don't have a lot of experience on life matters. I mean, I'd include myself in that, in having these things. I mean, the voting age used to be, I think in America at least, it used to be like 21 or 18 or, that age has changed a bit. But when the Constitution was written for a lot of these founding countries, it didn't, an 18-year-old, you had kids, like it wasn't, you'd been working and you'd been alone for a while. Often people, they don't move out of home till their late 30s, late 20s now. And I just can't help but feel that that's not the best way to have a very intelligent sort of approach to politics. But what are your views on this? Have I got this completely wrong, and should we just keep what it is, or?
Well, realistically, I don't think there's any prospect of increasing the voting age in Australia, but I wouldn't myself be in favour of lowering it. I mean, for some of the reasons that you suggested. I mean, one thing that I suppose has sometimes occurred to me as to whether we need to have compulsory voting, which we do in this country, unlike I think certainly in most European countries and the United States. I mean, voting is not compulsory. It suits the two major parties or perhaps all the political parties in Australia, because you don't have to spend any time and money getting people or persuading people to go to the polls. But I've just as a personal inclination, I mean, I'd be interested to see how the system worked if we didn't have compulsory voting, which of course would be in part reflect some of your concerns, because then only people would vote who actually had some kind of real interest in what they were doing.
I mean, look, the fundamental principle is if we call someone an adult at age 18, I think voting should go with that. I don't think it should be some sort of precondition that you have to be adequately well informed. I'm sure that would be an ideal democracy. You could argue from a more biological level, our brains actually aren't fully developed till we're in our mid-20s. So now, as we've learnt more about the brain, and arguably, you said your brother was you studying actuary. My father was an actuary too.
There you go.
So in some ways, they were ahead of the curve. So it was actually insurance risk assessments that showed that, so you don't pay, your premium doesn't come down till about age 25.
Yeah.
Right? So they saw that just from the rate of car accidents. And it wasn't until modern neuroscience that was actually confirmed that you saw the brains were still developed. So in some ways, the adolescent brain isn't kind of quite complete to an adult. till almost about age 25. So you could make almost a physiological argument that you shouldn't get a vote, till you're 25, or you shouldn't get your full license till you're approaching that.
Yeah.
But I certainly look that ultimately our system depends on this idea of autonomous individuals, and if we call them an adult at age 18, which is not completely unreasonable, and they have a lot of interest, they go to uni, they go to jobs, they start apprenticeships. So, anyone who's worked in elections, the good portion are not well informed. I'll never forget one of the last local government elections I was in. Just, the issues were, development or parks, and someone who came out, and I don't think they'd been out of the house for months. And they come out, their hair was undone. They could tell they'd barely seen the light. They're like a vampire. And I remember the guy came out and says, "No way I'm voting for gay marriage." Mate, it's a council election. It's got nothing to do with gay marriage. That's not an atypical version of an average voter. So if we made that a condition, that there'd be large sections of the population. We don't want to get too elitist like that. I think it's good that the population have to try and reach a broad base, and they actually have to think about people who may not understand things or may not be terribly educated.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I was purely curious on that one. That's interesting. I wanted to completely pivot to a different topic. It's on water in Australia. We love our water. It's it's the most precious thing on planet Earth. It's what makes planet Earth exciting. Section 100 of our Constitution. I did want to talk about this and whether or not we are basically bastardizing that section of the Constitution, which says that we pretty much can't trade the Australian water like we would a commodity. Yet we're seeing it. I mean, we're seeing a bunch of different companies. I mean, Duxton Water, just to name one, that has, I've heard, something like over 3/4 of the water in their ownership. Like all the water in their ownership could fill up Sydney Harbour 3/4 the way up. What is that? Are we allowed to be doing this sort of thing, Michael?
The problem in Australia, the basic problem is that we don't have enough water in most parts of the country. If you look at, apart from some of the coastal regions, I mean, Australia is a dry continent, and there's not a great deal that can be done about that. If you take something like the Murray-Darling Basin, you can talk about legal questions, but ultimately the only way you can resolve this, I think, is between negotiations between, in this case, there's 3 state governments involved. There have been negotiations. There is an agreement, although at the moment New South Wales is unhappy with quite a number of aspects of that. But as I say, the basic problem is that there isn't enough water to go round, so you're just going to have a problem, an allocation of a scarce resource. There's always going to be arguments as to what's the best way to do that. But I doubt that you can resolve any of this by terms of constitutional litigation. It seems to me it's a matter for political negotiation. But there is the problem that it is a scarce resource in almost all parts of Australia.
It certainly seems like, I mean, I'm no legal expert. I did a bit of law in university, but from my understanding of the Constitution, I totally thought that once all the states sort of signed up to this agreement to unify the nation, that this was sort of something, a carpet that could be pulled out from under them at any time. This is some sort of, these were the rules we were going to play by. You will not trade our water. And so I mean, a lot of farmers feel very passionately about this, and a lot of them have unfortunately lost their lives on this particular issue. But so you think it's definitely a political solution we should be seeking, not a legal solution?
I think that's right. As I say, there's obviously going to be problems with individuals in terms of where they're located, to take again the Murray-Darling Basin as an example. But someone, and it has to be, I suppose, at the government level, has to decide on the allocation of these resources. And an unsatisfactory solution, I think, to have various individuals litigating all of this when you need an overall solution.
I mean, what I've heard about this, and I'm hardly an expert on water, but I am an expert on rice. And a good friend of mine was a senior executive at Sunrise, and I learned a lot about the water politics in Australia. You learn all the different rice grains, basmati, short grain. Russians love short grain, the sushi rice, and there's jasmine rice.
Yeah.
But their argument is, it's less a legal solution than, and Michael alludes to this, and part of it is environmental demands have gone up a notch, and that's caused some real, I don't know the exact nitty-gritty of that, Michael's probably more familiar with it, but a lot of commercial interests, say farmers, rice companies and other commercial interests, would argue that there's certain environmental regulations or environmental demands now that have really that have pushed up the price of water.
Yeah.
And that's made it much more challenging for many of these groups. And Michael might have a view on that.
Well, there are differences between crops, of course. Cotton, I'm no expert on water either, I must say. But cotton, for example, I understand, is a great consumer of water. And that, of course, causes problems of relativities between people who are in different agricultural industries. I just have to come back to that basic proposition that there's always going to be a problem about this in Australia. If you fly over Australia, for example, from Sydney to Perth or from Sydney to Darwin, as I sometimes do, and you look down, you will see that there is you'll see the dryness of the continent. Indeed, I once drove when I was young from Melbourne to Perth. And can I say that for most of that journey, there was simply nothing there.
Vince Sorrentino calls it the great FA.
Nothing at all. I wonder if there'd be anything in the Bradfield scheme if they were to put that forward. Is there any credibility to that, or is that just a farce?
The Bradfield scheme?
Yeah, to sort of put... Have you guys heard of it?
I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can tell us.
It's basically something... My very... high-level understanding of it is it's a proposition that was put forward a little while ago by a bunch of different very wealthy people at the time, Alan Jones being one of them, Paco was one of them, Paco the Elder, and they basically put forward a scheme to sort of, I think it was dam up a few rivers and sort of channel the water in a way that would green the inner part of Australia.
Oh yeah, that sounds familiar. You're right.
And look, if we don't have to talk about that because it's certainly something I wouldn't want any of us to be talking on without having a lot of knowledge on it. I'm getting some people on the podcast that do know quite a bit about it. But I was curious to see if you'd heard about it, if there was sort of any credibility.
I do recall. I think now. Well, if there was any viability about the scheme, of course everyone would, in a sense, be in favour of it. But it must be said, I suppose, that most attempts in the past to try and deal with the problem haven't met with success.
Well, linking back with our early discussion, John, I mean, the pandemic may well decentralise lots of living, not just decentralise government.
Yeah. The
fact is, suddenly we don't necessarily need to live right next to a CBD.
Yeah.
And I know in Victoria already the regions have had something of a boost with some of the trends there. So it may well put a bigger focus on, okay, how do we get water to our regions more effectively?
Yeah.
So that may well be an interesting trend. Suddenly living in the regions, you may be far more attractive than it may have been.
I've been following this trend in America. It's very fascinating to see what's going on. They're having massive meat shortages. I mean, people are getting their water cut off, just everything with the riots going on. A lot of people are basically decentralizing, moving out into the, even rural, moving out rural. I thought, I just find it funny because our government's tried a whole bunch of things to get people out, in rural areas into these, forsaken towns, which used to be bustling. Like by making immigrants mandatorily go out there or create incentives for them to go out there and sort of repopulate these areas. But in America, I mean, they've got situations where basically they're truckers. They will not take food or whatever into some of these big, often Democrat-run cities because of how violent things are going on and, rioters not getting prosecuted. But yeah, look, I found it very interesting. But I'm glad you brought us back to the pandemic because I actually wanted to ask you guys, about the ACCC the Defence Act amendment, where the military can access people's property without a warrant, which is completely against the Westminster sort of system of law. Well, what's going on with that, Michael? I mean, we've sort of seen this sort of thing in Victoria, where we've seen the Premier there sort of use the military there, and the federal government bring the military to sort of help quell any unrest or manage the virus preparation. Is there any kind of legal standing on this, which is legal leg to stand on, really?
Well, in a legal sense, the role of the Defence Forces in Australia, normally outside of course, of their actual functions, at the Commonwealth level, they would normally have to be, and normally are, invited by the states to assist, for example, and I think that's happened in Victoria in some areas because of the pandemic. It happened, I think, in relation to the fires in New South Wales and Victoria earlier in the year. If the Commonwealth wanted to do this without the cooperation of the states, there'd be a whole lot of legal questions arise which no one has ever looked at in any detail to date, because it simply hasn't happened. In terms of entry onto properties, normally in this country that would be done by way of a search warrant. We've had a couple of cases recently. You might recall that about the middle of last year there was a search warrant executed on the ABC headquarters at Ultimo, and one on a News Limited journalist in Canberra, I think. The first of those, the ABC one, was upheld in its validity by the federal court. Second one was ultimately struck down in the High Court. In my experience, when you closely examine a search warrant, which very, very seldom happens, of course, because it's only if something has some sort of challenge to it has arisen. If you closely examine it, you almost invariably find that it hasn't been filled out correctly.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a problem, and sometimes it's not. But as I say, I think the notion of, in at least in Victoria, I don't think the Defence Forces were engaged in entering people's properties. I think at one time the police were knocking on doors to see if people who were supposed to be isolating themselves were at home. I think so, but that's an example of perhaps of unusual things that have happened over the last 6 months that, of course, would never have happened before that.
Look, Joel, I think some of it, may be warranted, but we can almost look at these trends, these broader trends of authoritarianism right around the world, and we often hear about it, say, on the right. We talk about Hungary or Trump and, these arguments that we're seeing a rise in fascism, but we don't always talk about it, happening on the left. And to some extent, this safetyism, for example, is a type of authoritarianism that can occur more strongly on the left. And I know psychologically there's a lot of kind of studies that go into the authoritarian mind and this kind of stuff. We're actually naturally built for hierarchy. So biologically, if you look at apes and all this kind of stuff, we are more attuned to hierarchy and looking up to almost authoritarian figures. To some extent, the complexity of the world is also driving some of these trends, because more and more people, you look at the rise in conspiracy theories, more and more people, as the world gets more and more complex, it almost gets harder and harder to tolerate, because our brains just can't tolerate that level of complexity. Yeah. So often then it's more attractive to go with slightly more simplistic explanations of the world, and that can also overlap with the strongman, authoritarian type of leader. So this is interesting. We talk about voting, etc. Arguably, democracy is a blip in human history.
Yeah.
And it's almost anti-biology.
Yeah.
And I'm not arguing against democracy. I think it's a great system, but you we need to be wary that it's certainly not a natural state.
Yes.
And it's a shaky state.
Yes. It's funny you said the phrase blip in human history. That was how basically democracy was described by a man who was testifying before the US Congress. He was talking about the dangers of big tech censorship. Now, technology is a very fascinating phenomenon, and as you said, there are things that happen in history which tend to accelerate existing trends going on. I think technology has been an absolutely fascinating one. I mean, I think it's made people in more echo chambers become a lot more violent, which has actually ended up spilling into the streets, as we've seen in the US. But look, I'd be curious to hear both your opinions on basically the effect of technology and how we've tried to adapt to that, and perhaps some of the trends that it's accelerated.
Michael, you want to kick off?
Well, I was talking recently about some of those trends, and it seems to me that if you look at it in a broad political sense, that social media and the internet have obviously had a big impact. I suspect largely not for the better, but there's no turning back from any of this, of course. In this area, quite where we go from here, the penetration is now so great of these in modern life that you wonder how much further impact they can have. But as I say, it seems to me to have been in many ways undesirable, but there's no point in complaining about something that where nothing can be done about it. We're just at the moment, of course, seeing a dispute between platforms like Google and Facebook with the federal government over payment for content from other media organisations, and in an area that I used to practice in to some extent when I was at the bar, defamation. There's been a very large surge in cases before the courts coming from social media in that area. Now, there's going to be hopefully by the start of next year some amendments to the uniform defamation legislation in the various states and territories, which will have a serious harm threshold added to the current legislation, which is designed to try and cut off some of those cases where they're essentially trivial complaints, often to a small number, published to a small number of people, where in fact those people are not likely to take it seriously, etc. So, but that's just one area where technology has, over just the last decade or so, has had a big impact. But as I say, just how much further all of this can go, I'm not entirely sure.
It's very concerning. I mean, the ACCC draft bargaining code that's been put forward, this show will basically be dead if that. At this stage, with it in its current form, this show's not going to basically work, because, I mean, the fact that these Fairfax 9 News Corp are going to have access to the algorithms is going to be very devastating to a lot of alternate media. The fact that they're going to have the algorithm, 20 or so days before it's released, that's going to be really detrimental. So I mean, there's a lot of concerns about that regarding the bargaining code and what that will mean.
Well, we've seen Facebook already threaten not to allow sharing of news, so it's got a way to go yet.
Yeah.
Companies like Facebook and Google are probably more powerful than the Australian government, so we'll see how it plays out.
Yes.
I mean, look, on technology, overall, I would say it's been, far and away beneficial compared to negative, but it's a very fascinating aspect of mental health, and I've seen it, I guess, in my career after I've qualified. So I've been a psychiatrist for a little bit over a decade, and just seeing these trends in all the patients we see, particularly younger patients, adolescents.
Yeah.
I mean, one obvious thing is how it magnifies certain things. So, for example, bullying. So previously, I might see a kid who's being bullied in the playground, whereas now, it might be 2 or 3 people in the playground, but now they come home and suddenly that can be, 20, 30 people, hundreds of people. Well, it can feel like that to them. Yeah. Another aspect is how it normalises a lot of psychopathology. So, for example, I'll have patients who are self-harmers and you're there trying to help them, etc. But yet when they go home, they'll be on a group with 15 other people who share pictures of them self-harming and put them up on the site and as a performance.
Yeah,
and suddenly they feel like, you know what, it's not that abnormal. So you could be a terrorist, a pedophile or a self-harmer, and suddenly the internet can normalise all this psychopathology, and that can add these sort of complications as well. But obviously on another level, it also drives lots of belonging, and we're looking at a time now where you can connect with people digitally, and overall that's, I think, hugely beneficial. It's, it has brought together the world in all manner of ways, and particularly a lot of poorer countries. I mean, my ancestry in Bangladesh, I mean, that's one of the things that can really free the extremely poor, and to some extent that has happened, where you'll have people in the village, suddenly with the phone now, and they can bring up like an internet connection, they can see the price in the local market, and they can sell. So I don't think we have to be wary of that whole Silicon Valley philosophy of the techno-utopia. And that everyone should everything should give way to this vision of a techno-utopia. Because I think that can be quite, the elements of that can be quite naive, and that this combination of the libertarian ethos and this techno-utopia that you see with a lot of the kind of the big Silicon Valley enthusiasts. So we have to be very wary of that. But there's no question, with appropriate regulation, and I think that's where the government thing is good. I think we can't just let, these are such new companies, and they are effectively utilities. They're essential, and they're in every corner of our lives. So whether or not the current ACCC thing gets up or does have any sort of teeth, I think the broader trend of going, you know what, we've got to find the right way to manage this. We can't just let loose.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, have you got anything to add, Michael, on that?
Only that there is a risk, of course, for the federal government in all this, that Google and Facebook might simply say, well, we don't need to operate in Australia. It's not our largest part of our business. So it's always seemed to me that there was some risk in all of this, but I suppose the likelihood is that there will be some sorts of negotiated settlement about it. But as I say, you can't necessarily assume that, I don't think, at the moment.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article last month on basically Google, Facebook, Twitter, and in 2016 they swayed anywhere from 2.6 to 10.4 million votes in the US, from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. And they used a number of different algorithmic sort of tweaks, such as changing the suggestion bar in Google. So if you start typing Hillary and it pops down with suggestions, it'll say Hillary will win. Hillary, first female president, Hillary. And with Trump, you get stuff like Hillary, racist. Trump racist, Trump this, Trump that. In fact, fun fact, you can try this when you guys leave. If you go on Twitter and you type racist into the search bar, Donald Trump's profile will come up. I'm not even kidding. It's amazing. Even on Facebook, and this doesn't really affect us that much, Facebook can pick who they send reminder messages to go out and vote. Now in Australia, that wouldn't do anything because we all mandatorily vote. But in the US, that's a massive. That is massive. Yeah, absolutely. Because they've only got about 130 million people that vote every year, every presidential election. But yeah, look, it's certainly something I'm very concerned about. But look, you mentioned technology and how that can often spill over into the real world, whether it's with bullying, and I mean, you can't just change school with bullying if it follows you online. I did want to touch on this very last topic. We're seeing a lot of anger online with what's happening in COVID, understandably so. I mean, there's 1 million people out of work. We're seeing calls skyrocket in terms of the suicide hotline. there are going to be protests this Saturday, actually. So this is for the 5th of September, for those of you watching. A lot of these protests have been shut down, Michael. Is this a sort of a trampling on people's rights to not be able to do that? Or does the sort of the chief medical health officer have a say on this to say, no, what I say goes, and you can't protest even if you've lost your job and you're not happy with how the government's running things? Is there any sort of
well, in normal circumstances, there's no problem about protests in this country. Most the states and territories have a regime, applications to the police and control of traffic and so on. It's only that in the last 6 months, where you've had the problem of gatherings generally, that there's been a question about whether some of those would go ahead. Some of them have gone ahead anyway, of course. And I think what it's indicated in those cases is that whatever the legal position, if the people who are conducting the protests say they're going to proceed, well, there's very little that anyone can do about it, including the police. You can't arrest 5,000 people. I mean, it goes without saying. I think, given the problems of large gatherings at the moment, my personal view is that it is reasonable to to say that those sorts of protests ought not proceed at the moment, in the same way that a whole lot of other gatherings can't proceed. But you have to balance this against, for example, you can have certain sort of crowds now at sporting events. I mean, it's just a question of balancing that, all of that out. The fact that it's a protest against the current regime in relation to health questions is, of course, not a reason why it shouldn't proceed. But if we go back to, in a sense, to where we started with this, there has been remarkably little, I think, dissension in this country in relation to the sorts of regimes that have been instituted. That's why I say there's a very big difference in the two societies from the United States, where and it is interesting. I mean, Tanveer's talked about this, the culture of compliance, and it's been pretty pronounced, I think, in Australia over this period. Now, some people have spoken about it and complained about the kind of regimes that have been instituted. But in terms of the general population, and certainly I think when we had the experience in Sydney of things being closed down for 5 or 6 weeks, I mean, I must say I was always surprised. I mean, if you're walking out in the streets and so on, how people were largely observing all of those regimes, and the CBD, for example, was pretty much deserted. I mean, for most of that period.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the city just before we had our initial meeting before this interview, and when I was meeting you, I wanted to have a lovely meal at the bar just near where you work, and I had a conversation with the owners there. They were also sitting at the bar too. They weren't having scotch. But I have to ask these people when I see them, because you don't always have the opportunity. If we go into a lockdown again, are you guys going to manage? And they basically said no. There's no way we're going to manage. We can't do another round of this. So
for me, Joel, it's often the inconsistencies around messaging. You know, what's appropriate, what's not. So one level, you can have a wedding socially distanced, but then, well, why can't you have a protest socially distanced? I mean, I get sometimes it's tough to, for example, you might have a climate protest and it's hard to tell how many people are going to turn up. So I think there can be challenges there.
Yeah.
But I think I think one thing people do get irked up about, and appropriately, is just a whole set of inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And we do know a lot more about the disease now. I think in March, April, it's so uncertain, so I can imagine a bit of clamour and messiness there, but we know quite a bit more now. So things like, when people getting fined for sunbaking in a park or something, that's silly. I mean, the risk is so low. And same with a lot of outdoor functions. The reality is a lot of outdoor things where there's open ventilation, etc. The risk is significantly lower of spreading COVID. So this is where I think the government could do a lot better, where just have more consistency. And that's where things like, I think there was a big mistake in Victoria where the Black Lives Matter was almost encouraged, whereas everywhere else it was either banned or certainly not encouraged. So I think there were very different signals in Victoria, and you could make an argument that that's had a broader impact. It's hard to make a direct link to quarantine mistakes, but it gives a wider message to the public.
Well, there were actually 2 cases that were attending those marches.
That's true, yeah.
So
that's right.
That's the funny thing that hasn't been mentioned. I've seen that mentioned once in an article by the mainstream media, just once. Other than that, the fall guy for this has either been the meat factories, which, the meat processors in Victoria, and obviously the massive debacle of hiring not private security, but a private security company to not trained to basically manage the hotel quarantine, which was clearly warned about. But look, I'd be curious. Would you say, Tanveer, that you'd advocate more of a Swedish-style lockdown rather than what we're seeing in Victoria, the stage 4 lockdown?
Yeah. Look, I think in Victoria, hopefully they can ease these lockdowns. I know Dan Andrews trying to bring in the state of emergency powers. Look, the truth is I'm not entirely sure. I think the way New South Wales is doing it is reasonably, I think, is appropriate. Where you have really strong resourcing around testing, tracing, and be super aggressive there as much as you can. Look at Korea and stuff, and they were really intense. Whether we're able to do that, again, in a freer society. Yeah. But I think we can manage it. If you're having 10, 20 cases a day, I mean, that's manageable. And because we're doing so many tests now, we're getting the results back quickly. My daughters have had to come out of school for a day for a quick test, and we got the results straight away. So I actually think the way New South Wales handling it is the right way. But then the challenge will be, how do we steadily open up? And I think we're ready to open up at least a little. I think things like the gatherings, and we should be able to have both Michael and I have a book out, for example. And I'm not saying that's some sort of priority, but we should be able to have small events, for example, socially distanced. So I think some of those things. I think we need to be thinking of the next step, and certainly the border. Like some of these things, they don't make any sense anymore. They're more about political posturing. Yeah. And that's the bit we really have to challenge.
Yes.
I don't believe in laissez-faire and let everything rip. I certainly don't believe in that.
Okay.
So I think we need to find a balance. But ultimately, this disease, it's not. As a doctor, it's a pretty intense disease potentially, and even though the risk is much lower if you're younger. We're seeing some very unusual cases, and the full nature of the disease we're still learning about. It's certainly not a flu. So when I see, particularly in conservative forums where you're seeing people come and go, it's just like the flu and stuff, and go, it's not the flu. I can assure you of that.
Yeah. Michael, got anything to add on that?
Well, I think people have to realise that it's not going to be possible to eliminate this the virus at least in the medium term. There's going to have to be some sort of trade-off here between economic issues and personal liberty issues as well. They're going to be matters for reasonably nice judgment, I think. And so far, for example, in New South Wales, I think that's worked reasonably well. Victoria was an unusual case because most of its problems arose from a couple of instances that didn't arise in other parts of the country. But for all of those, assuming that Victoria to some extent gets on a level with the other areas of the country, they're all going to have to, as I say, at least in the foreseeable future, try and operate in to some extent. Even though there will be continuation of cases on a day-by-day basis, but hopefully not ones that that get out of control. In other words, you're not going to get back to the situation that you had prior to 6 months ago.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are itching to see a bit more of that common sense sort of percolate into it. I mean, people have some serious doubts when someone comes out like Brett Sutton, and he pretty much says that not all COVID deaths are necessarily due to COVID. People have valid questions, and I think more data is definitely the best way to go. But also, I think a lot of people are they're forgetting. They're very upset naturally, but they are forgetting to humanise a lot of the premiers as well. I'm more conservative, and I definitely see there's a very big move on the right to sort of demonise Dan Andrews, and it's very easy to. I don't blame them. But we need to. But I always try to listen to at least maybe 30 minutes to an hour of him speak a day, because these things, people can get very animalistic, and it's not pretty, pretty much.
But I think some of that is driving the support in states, where it feels like, well, he may have stuffed up, but he's our man.
Yeah.
So some of it is driving a parochialism when they see their own premiers getting attacked, especially from, say, conservative radio hosts out in interstate.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be careful of that too.
Absolutely. Look, gentlemen, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed picking your brains apart. Do you guys have any social media you wanted to plug for this episode? I mean, obviously, I want to show this book off as much as possible, In Defense of Shame and Dissenting Opinions. I've read both of these, and they've been very fascinating to read. I started reading In Defense of Shame. It's a very short read. One of my friends finished it, and he couldn't recommend it more highly. So well done, gentlemen. Well done on these. If you guys want to pick apart Brexit or some of the other geopolitical issues taking place in our country, read this book. It's really good, by Michael. Social media, anything at all? Or?
Not for me.
Are you still writing articles? I haven't seen anything very recently.
I had one last week in The Australian about immigration and refugees.
I look forward to reading it. Beautiful. Thank you, Michael. Have you got any social?
I guess I've got a Twitter handle at Dr. T Ahmed. That's about it. You got my Facebook, etc. But I'm not terribly active. Probably could be more active.
But you're very active on Sky News, which is excellent.
Yeah, my AFR column as well. Yeah, monthly AFR column.
Beautiful. Well, everyone, please get out and check out these books. But thank you very much for tuning in. Please give this a share. That's the best thing you can do to fight against censorship. Thanks, John.
Pleasure. Thanks, John.
Yeah,
Awesome.
very welcome.